The real scarcity is not resources. It's permission. We live in the richest civilization in human history. We have more engineers than any generation before us, more capital, more computing power, more scientific knowledge. We can simulate proteins, automate logistics, design cities in software, and connect global teams in seconds. If intelligence and tools were the binding constraints on progress, we would be living in an age of breathtaking acceleration. And yet, we are stalled. Housing is unaffordable in the cities where opportunity concentrates. Clean energy projects take years, sometimes decades, to secure approval. Infrastructure costs multiples of what peer countries pay. Public works are delayed not by lack of money, but by process. Even when there is broad agreement on the goal, more housing, faster transit, modernized grids, decarbonization, delivery lags. This contradiction sits at the heart of Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson. The central claim is deceptively simple. The defining scarcity of our time is not material. It is procedural. It is institutional. It is permission. We do not lack resources. We lack the ability to deploy them at speed and scale. In the 20th century, politics was shaped by tangible scarcity. There were not enough homes, not enough energy, not enough industrial capacity. Governments were judged by how much they could build. The New Deal constructed dams and highways. Post-war America built suburbs, universities, power plants. The state was a builder. Its legitimacy flowed from visible production. Over time, that orientation shifted. Beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, a wave of reforms expanded public participation and oversight, environmental review laws, historic preservation protections, community input processes, litigation pathways, zoning controls. Each reform was born from real abuses: polluted rivers, discriminatory development, communities steamrolled by highways. These reforms had moral force. They constrained reckless growth. They elevated voices previously ignored. They made harm harder. But layered together over decades, they created something else: a dense web of veto points. Today, in many jurisdictions, almost any significant project can be delayed or blocked. A housing development can be stalled by neighborhood opposition. A transmission line can be halted by lawsuits. A transit project can be slowed by overlapping review requirements. The state still funds. It still regulates, but it struggles to build. Permission, not capital, becomes the bottleneck. Consider housing in prosperous metropolitan areas. Demand rises because jobs cluster, productivity increases, and people want to live near opportunity. In a functional market, rising demand triggers rising supply. Developers build upward. Density increases. Prices stabilize over time. But when zoning restricts height, when local approval processes stretch for years, when community opposition can indefinitely delay projects, supply cannot respond. The market does what markets do under constrained supply. Prices rise. The result is not dynamic growth, but exclusion. Only those with significant income or wealth can access opportunity-rich regions. The same pattern repeats in energy. If the climate crisis requires rapid deployment of renewable infrastructure, the ability to build quickly is essential. Solar farms, wind installations, battery storage, transmission lines, these are not theoretical. They are physical systems requiring land use, approval, environmental review, and community acceptance. Yet projects aligned with decarbonization goals often encounter the same procedural barriers as fossil fuel infrastructure. Environmental law, originally crafted to restrain pollution, now slows renewable build-out. Local opposition resists visual change. Multi-layered review processes stretch timelines far beyond what climate science recommends. Again, the constraint is not engineering capability. It is authorization. This is not an argument against regulation. It is an argument about accumulation. Every new safeguard is reasonable in isolation. Over time, safeguards compound. Approval becomes labyrinthine. Responsibility fragments across agencies. Risk aversion dominates institutional culture. Delays become normal. A society can become highly skilled at saying no. In such a society, even when political coalitions agree on goals, execution falters. Funding can be appropriated, but projects stall. Plans can be drafted, but timelines extend. The state grows in complexity without growing in delivery capacity. The consequences are not merely economic, they are psychological. When systems fail to deliver visible improvements, affordable housing, reliable transit, modern infrastructure, public trust erodes. Politics becomes performative rather than productive. Anger replaces optimism. Scarcity narratives intensify. If growth feels blocked, zero-sum thinking spreads. Abundance in this framework is not about excess consumption. It is about regained capacity. An abundant society is one where institutions can translate collective will into physical outcomes, where regulatory safeguards exist but do not metastasize into paralysis, where participation informs decisions but does not endlessly defer them, where the state is capable of building as well as regulating. Permission, then, is a structural asset. Countries that can approve and deploy infrastructure efficiently gain competitive advantage. Regions that can expand housing supply retain talent. Governments that can deliver clean energy rapidly shape global markets. Speed and competence compound just as capital does. For investors and builders, this insight is crucial. Structural bottlenecks distort markets. When housing supply is artificially constrained, rents and property values rise. When grid expansion lags, energy costs fluctuate. When permitting is slow, project risk increases. But bottlenecks also create opportunity. Technologies that streamline permitting, modular construction systems that reduce site-specific delays, energy storage innovations that bypass transmission constraints. These are responses to permission scarcity. Ultimately, the book reframes a moral question. In a wealthy society, is it acceptable that homes are scarce where opportunity thrives? That clean energy projects are delayed despite urgency? That infrastructure costs balloon because process overwhelms execution? If the answer is no, then reform must address not only funding, but function. The real scarcity is not land, sunlight, wind, capital, or intelligence. It is the ability to align rules with outcomes, to balance protection with production, to grant permission at the speed of necessity. Abundance is not naive optimism. It is institutional competence. It is a society confident enough to build again. Part 1. From Scarcity to Stagnation. For most of modern political history, scarcity was obvious. There were not enough homes, not enough food, not enough electricity, not enough infrastructure. The problem was material and visible. Governments were judged by their ability to expand capacity, to produce more steel, pour more concrete, electrify more regions, and house more families. In the early and mid-20th century, growth required building at scale. The United States constructed highways that stitched the country together. It built dams that powered cities. It expanded universities to educate a growing middle class. Europe rebuilt itself after war through massive public works and industrial coordination. The state was not merely a regulator, it was an architect of abundance. Political coalitions were organized around production. Labor and capital fought over distribution, but both assumed that the pie could expand. Economic growth was not. Theoretical, it was visible in new suburbs, new power plants, new factories, and rising wages. Scarcity was something to be overcome through construction. But by the 1970s, the nature of scarcity began to change. The industrial boom had created new problems: pollution, environmental degradation, urban displacement, discriminatory planning, highways slicing through neighborhoods. Communities that had been ignored demanded voice. Environmentalists demanded safeguards. Civil rights movements demanded protection from abuse. The political response was a wave of reforms designed to prevent harm. Environmental review laws required impact assessments before projects could proceed. Zoning codes were tightened to preserve neighborhood character. Public hearings expanded local participation. Legal pathways made it easier to challenge developments in court. These reforms were not mistakes. They were moral correctives. They slowed reckless growth and forced planners to consider consequences. They democratized development decisions. But reforms accumulate. Each new layer of oversight was rational in isolation. Over time, however, these layers interacted. Environmental review overlapped with zoning restrictions. Community input overlapped with historic preservation rules. Federal, state, and local approvals stacked on top of one another. The process of building became a sequence of permissions, each with its own timeline, standards, and potential for delay. Scarcity shifted from material to procedural. It was no longer that society lacked the ability to build. It was that the path to building became increasingly complex. This transformation was subtle. The language of policy still emphasized growth, equity, and progress. Funding for infrastructure expanded periodically. Housing demand rose in productive cities. Climate goals called for rapid energy transitions. Yet execution slowed. In metropolitan areas with strong economic growth, housing supply failed to keep pace with demand. Instead of expanding density, many cities locked in low-rise zoning patterns. Height limits preserved neighborhood aesthetics, but restricted the number of units that could be built. Approval processes stretched across years. Local opposition could delay or derail projects through public hearings or litigation. As demand continued to rise, fueled by job concentration in technology, finance, and services, prices escalated. The predictable economic response to constrained supply is higher cost. What once had been a problem of insufficient income became a problem of insufficient units. Scarcity was no longer about lacking land or capital. It was about permission to use them. Energy policy followed a similar arc. The late 20th century environmental movement rightly focused on reducing pollution and protecting ecosystems. Regulatory tools were designed to evaluate environmental impact before approving industrial activity. But as climate change emerged as an existential challenge, the need shifted from restraint to rapid deployment of cleaner systems. Building renewable energy infrastructure requires land, transmission corridors, and coordinated approvals. Yet these projects often face the same review processes originally designed to slow fossil fuel expansion. The paradox is striking. Laws created to prevent environmental harm can delay infrastructure intended to mitigate environmental harm. Meanwhile, infrastructure costs ballooned. Transit projects in some American cities cost multiples of comparable systems abroad. Layers of contracting, oversight, and litigation increased complexity. Risk aversion became institutionalized. The state remained capable of allocating funds, but its capacity to deliver projects on time and on budget eroded. This is the stagnation Klein and Thompson describe. It is not stagnation in innovation. The private sector continues to generate breakthroughs in software, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. It is stagnation in collective physical capacity, the ability to translate political will into material outcomes. The political consequences are profound. When housing costs consume an increasing share of income, geographic mobility declines. Workers cannot easily move to opportunity-rich regions. Inequality widens between homeowners who benefit from rising asset values and renters who face escalating costs. Resentment grows. When infrastructure lags, productivity suffers, commutes lengthen, energy systems strain under demand, public confidence weakens. When governments promise transformation, green transitions, affordable housing, modernized transit, but deliver slowly or not at all, voters lose faith. The gap between rhetoric and reality becomes fertile ground for populism. Stagnation is not dramatic. It is incremental. It accumulates over decades. Each delay feels procedural, each restriction justified. But the cumulative effect is a society that builds less than it intends. The contrast with the mid-century builder ethos becomes sharper in hindsight. Earlier eras also faced opposition, budget constraints, and political conflict. But institutional design favored execution. Authority was centralized enough to move projects forward. Legal challenges were limited in scope and duration. The bias of the system leaned toward completion. Today, the bias often leans toward caution. Caution is understandable in a complex society. But when caution becomes the dominant organizing principle, growth slows. The problem is not that regulation exists. It is that the balance between protection and production has tilted heavily toward prevention. Scarcity reemerges in a new form. Not the scarcity of resources, but the scarcity of throughput. The scarcity of approved projects. The scarcity of units delivered. The scarcity of megawatts connected to the grid. This shift reshapes economic dynamics. When supply is constrained structurally, price signals intensify. Housing appreciates not only because of demand, but because of policy-imposed limits. Energy costs fluctuate not only because of fuel inputs, but because of grid bottlenecks. Infrastructure becomes expensive not only due to materials, but due to procedural drag. In this environment, stagnation coexists with wealth. GDP may grow, technology may advance, financial markets may expand, yet the built environment lags behind collective need. The deeper issue is institutional capacity. A society can be wealthy, yet incapable of building quickly. It can have capital markets that move billions in seconds, but permitting systems that take years. It can fund programs generously, but struggle to coordinate agencies effectively. From scarcity to stagnation is not a moral failure. It is a structural evolution. Systems designed to correct past harms, when left unadjusted, can constrain future progress. The challenge, then, is recalibration. How can a society preserve environmental safeguards, community voice, and legal accountability while restoring the ability to build at scale? How can it maintain democratic participation without allowing perpetual veto? How can it streamline process without sacrificing protection? These questions define the transition from stagnation to abundance. Because abundance is not about ignoring constraints. It is about designing institutions that can manage them without paralysis. The 20th century solved material scarcity through construction. The 21st century must solve procedural scarcity through institutional redesign. Until then, stagnation persists, not because we lack resources, but because we have made permission the scarcest asset of all. Part 2. The housing crisis as a systems failure. If there is one issue that makes the argument of abundance concrete, it is housing. Housing is not abstract. It is the most immediate expression of whether a society can translate growth into shared opportunity. When homes are plentiful, people move toward jobs, wages rise with productivity, and cities become engines of upward mobility. When homes are scarce, opportunity becomes gated, not by law, but by price. The modern housing crisis in many prosperous regions is not primarily a failure of markets. It is a failure of systems. At its core, housing follows a simple economic principle. When demand increases, supply should expand. If more people want to live in a city because it offers high wages, strong schools, cultural vibrancy, and professional opportunity, developers respond by building more units. Over time, increased supply stabilizes prices. This mechanism works, but only when supply is allowed to respond. In many high-opportunity metropolitan areas, especially along the American coasts, supply does not respond. Zoning laws limit density. Height restrictions cap the number of units on valuable land. Large portions of urban land are reserved for single-family homes. Approval processes are slow and uncertain. Community opposition can delay projects indefinitely. Environmental review laws add layers of complexity even for urban infill development. The result is structural inelasticity. Demand rises, but supply remains fixed or grows only marginally. Prices escalate, rents climb. Home ownership becomes inaccessible to middle-income households. Economic sorting intensifies. The wealthy cluster in opportunity-rich cities, while lower-income workers are pushed to distant suburbs or entirely different regions. This is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of a system designed to slow building. The irony is that many of the most restrictive cities are politically progressive. Their leaders advocate equity, climate action, and social mobility, yet housing policy often undermines these goals. When zoning protects low-density neighborhoods in urban cores, it limits the number of families who can access strong job markets and public services. It entrenches inequality. The housing crisis, then, is not simply about insufficient units. It is about governance architecture. Consider zoning. Zoning originated as a way to separate incompatible land uses. Heavy industry from residential neighborhoods, for example. Over time, however, zoning evolved into a tool for shaping neighborhood character. Minimum lot sizes, setback requirements, parking mandates, and height limits restricted what could be built. In many cities, large swaths of land were designated exclusively for detached single-family homes. This designation effectively caps density. Even if land values justify taller buildings or multi-family units, zoning forbids it. Developers must seek variances or rezoning, which trigger public hearings and potential opposition. The process becomes uncertain and time-consuming. Financing becomes riskier. Fewer projects proceed. The cumulative effect is dramatic. In high-demand cities, housing production lags far behind population growth and job creation. Workers compete for limited units. Rents rise faster than wages. Young professionals delay family formation. Long commutes become normalized as people move farther from urban cores in search of affordability. Mobility, one of the great strengths of dynamic economies, declines. Historically, Americans moved toward opportunity. Industrial expansion drew workers to cities. Technological booms attracted migrants to innovation hubs. Today, housing costs deter migration. Studies show that high housing prices in productive cities reduce overall economic output by preventing workers from relocating to higher-wage regions. The housing crisis is therefore not merely local, it is national. It constrains aggregate productivity. It amplifies inequality between homeowners and renters. It distorts wealth accumulation, as property owners benefit from rising asset values, while non-owners struggle to enter the market. The system also shapes generational outcomes. Homeownership has long been a primary pathway to middle-class wealth. When entry prices surge beyond reach, wealth-building opportunities narrow. Younger generations face higher debt burdens and lower housing security than previous cohorts did at comparable ages. Intergenerational divides sharpen. The climate dimension adds another layer. Low-density zoning contributes to sprawl. When housing near job centers is scarce, development shifts outward. Longer commutes increase transportation emissions. Infrastructure costs rise as roads, utilities, and public services extend over larger geographic areas. Restrictive zoning in urban cores can inadvertently worsen environmental outcomes. In this sense, housing policy intersects with climate policy. Yet reform is politically difficult because the beneficiaries of scarcity are concentrated and vocal. Homeowners in desirable neighborhoods benefit from rising property values. They often fear that increased density will alter neighborhood aesthetics, strain schools, or reduce property values. They attend public hearings. They organize. The beneficiaries of new housing, future residents, young families, workers not yet living in the area, are diffuse and often absent from local decision-making processes. This asymmetry shapes outcomes. Local governance structures frequently grant significant influence to neighborhood groups. Public comment periods and approval boards create opportunities for opposition. Even when projects meet zoning requirements, they can be delayed through appeals and litigation. In effect, voice becomes veto. From a systems perspective, this is critical. A process that allows a small number of stakeholders to delay projects serving larger populations will tend toward underproduction. Risk increases for developers. Costs rise due to delays and legal expenses. Fewer projects are initiated. The system self-reinforces scarcity. Addressing the housing crisis therefore requires systemic change, not merely subsidies. Subsidies can help low-income households afford high rents, but they do not increase supply. Inclusionary zoning mandates can create some affordable units, but if they are layered onto already restrictive environments, they may further deter development. Tax incentives can stimulate construction at the margin, but if zoning caps density, incentives have limited impact. Supply must expand meaningfully. That expansion often requires shifting authority from hyperlocal veto points to broader regional or state-level frameworks. It may involve upzoning near transit corridors, reducing parking mandates, streamlining environmental review for urban infill, and standardizing approval processes to reduce uncertainty. Such reforms do not eliminate community input. They rebalance it. The central insight of abundance is that housing scarcity in wealthy regions is not a natural phenomenon. It is constructed through policy. The same society that built vast suburbs in the mid-20th century now struggles to build apartments near train stations. The constraint is institutional. For investors and builders, this matters deeply. Housing markets are shaped less by raw land availability than by regulatory design. When supply is artificially constrained, prices rise persistently. That dynamic creates political pressure for reform, but reform unfolds unevenly. Regions that succeed in streamlining housing approvals and increasing density will capture economic dynamism. Those that resist will face escalating costs and declining mobility. Ultimately, the housing crisis is a mirror. It reflects how governance structures balance protection and production. It reveals whether institutions can adapt to changing economic realities. It tests whether democratic systems can deliver abundance rather than manage scarcity. A functioning housing system does not guarantee equality, but a dysfunctional one guarantees exclusion. If abundance is the goal, housing is the proving ground. Because a society that cannot build homes where opportunity thrives will struggle to build anything else at the scale the future demands. Part 3. Energy, Climate, and the Build Problem. If housing reveals the mechanics of scarcity at the local level, energy reveals it at the planetary level. Climate change is not a marginal policy issue. It is a systems challenge that requires the largest infrastructure transformation in modern history. Decarbonization demands the rapid deployment of renewable energy, electrification of transportation, modernization of grids, large-scale storage solutions, and potentially new nuclear technologies. The technology exists. The capital exists. The urgency certainly exists. The bottleneck is building. To understand the magnitude of the problem, consider what the energy transition actually requires. Solar farms must be constructed at scale. Wind turbines must be installed across vast territories. Transmission lines must connect remote renewable generation sites to dense urban demand centers. Electric vehicle charging networks must blanket highways and neighborhoods. Battery storage facilities must smooth intermittency. Each of these components involves land use, environmental review, interagency coordination, financing approvals, and community negotiation. The energy transition is not merely technological, it is administrative. In the mid-20th century, energy expansion was fast. Large dams were built in years. Nuclear plants were constructed rapidly during their early rollout. Transmission lines spread across the country. Environmental considerations were minimal by modern standards, and centralized authority allowed swift decision-making. Today, the regulatory landscape is fundamentally different. Environmental review laws require comprehensive impact statements before major projects proceed. Public consultation periods allow communities to object. Multiple levels of government, federal, state, local, may have jurisdiction over different aspects of a project. Legal challenges can pause development for years. These protections exist for good reasons. Past energy projects cause displacement, ecological damage, and long-term health consequences. The regulatory system evolved to prevent repetition of those harms. But climate change introduces a paradox. The environmental framework built to slow industrial expansion now slows decarbonization, infrastructure. Renewable projects frequently encounter resistance similar to that faced by fossil fuel infrastructure. Communities object to wind turbines, altering landscapes. Transmission lines are challenged for crossing protected habitats. Solar farms are contested over land use. Even grid modernization faces procedural delay. The result is a misalignment between climate ambition and delivery capacity. Legislative packages can allocate billions for clean energy incentives. Tax credits can stimulate investment. Yet if permitting timelines stretch across a decade, the speed of decarbonization remains insufficient. The build problem is not about engineering feasibility. It is about institutional throughput. Transmission is perhaps the clearest example. Renewable energy is often generated in geographically optimal but remote areas. Deserts for solar, plains and offshore zones for wind. To reach population centers, high-capacity transmission lines must be constructed. These lines cross multiple jurisdictions, triggering layered review processes. Landowners may resist. Environmental groups may litigate. Approval timelines extend. Without transmission expansion, renewable generation cannot scale effectively. Projects are curtailed. Investment becomes riskier. Energy markets remain constrained. Speed matters because climate change is cumulative. Delays translate into higher long-term emissions and greater adaptation costs. Every year of procedural gridlock compounds environmental risk. There is also a geopolitical dimension. Countries that can deploy clean energy infrastructure rapidly will shape the global energy economy. They will dominate manufacturing of components, control supply chains for critical minerals, and export technology. Energy abundance confers strategic leverage. If permitting systems slow deployment, competitive advantage erodes. The build problem also affects cost. When projects are delayed, financing costs increase. Contractors face uncertainty. Material prices fluctuate over extended timelines. Litigation adds expense. A project that might have been economically viable under streamlined approval can become marginal under prolonged delay. This dynamic feeds political backlash. Clean energy becomes associated with high costs rather than efficiency gains. Opposition narratives strengthen. Importantly, the build problem is not exclusively environmental regulation. It is institutional fragmentation. Responsibility for energy policy often spans multiple agencies. Planning and approval processes are sequential rather than parallel. Data systems may be outdated, expertise may be dispersed, risk aversion shapes decision-making as agencies seek to avoid litigation or scandal. Modern governance tends to prioritize accountability over execution speed. Every step is documented. Every decision is reviewable. This protects against abuse, but it slows construction. The tension is clear. How can societies maintain environmental integrity and democratic participation while accelerating clean energy deployment? The answer is not deregulation in the simplistic sense. Eliminating review entirely would reintroduce past harms and undermine public trust. Instead, reform requires redesign. Processes can be consolidated. Timelines can be standardized. Agencies can coordinate rather than sequence approvals. Environmental review for clearly beneficial projects, such as grid modernization or urban renewable installations, can be streamlined without abandoning safeguards. In other words, protection and production must be balanced rather than layered without limit. The energy transition is a stress test for institutional capacity. It reveals whether modern states can act with urgency while preserving legitimacy. It tests whether regulatory systems designed in one era can adapt to new challenges. It exposes the cost of procedural inertia. Energy scarcity in wealthy societies today is rarely about lack of fuel. It is about infrastructure constraints. Grids reach capacity. Transmission lags demand. Storage is insufficient. The physical systems that deliver energy are outdated or incomplete. Abundance in energy would mean more than lower prices. It would mean resilience. It would mean decarbonization at scale. It would mean strategic autonomy in an era of geopolitical competition. But abundance requires building, and building requires permission. The core insight of abundance applies powerfully here. When the path to approval is so complex that even broadly supported projects struggle to proceed, society enters a state of self-imposed constraint. Climate change does not pause while paperwork circulates. Energy demand does not stabilize while hearings extend. The question is not whether safeguards matter. They do. The question is whether safeguards have multiplied to the point of undermining the very goals they were designed to protect. A clean energy future is technically achievable. The cost curves for renewables have declined dramatically. Innovation continues in storage and grid management. Private capital is ready. What remains uncertain is whether institutions can adapt quickly enough. Energy, climate, and the build problem converge on a single structural challenge: aligning democratic process with temporal urgency. If societies cannot accelerate the construction of clean infrastructure, they risk locking in environmental damage and economic disadvantage. Abundance in the energy era is not simply about generating more power. It is about restoring the capacity to build the systems that power the future. Part 4. The Crisis of State Capacity. If housing exposes the local dysfunction of modern governance and energy reveals the national urgency of institutional performance, state capacity is the underlying variable connecting both. State capacity is not ideology. It is not left or right. It is the practical ability of a government to design policy, execute projects, coordinate agencies, and deliver outcomes at scale. It is the difference between announcing transformation and achieving it. The crisis described in abundance is not that governments lack ambition. It is that they increasingly lack delivery competence. Modern states are extraordinarily good at writing checks. They can transfer money through tax credits, stimulus payments, subsidies, and entitlement programs with impressive efficiency. The machinery of financial redistribution functions at speed. But building physical systems, transit lines, housing, energy grids, water infrastructure has become slow, expensive, and procedurally dense. This asymmetry defines the crisis. Over decades, governments evolved toward risk minimization. Oversight expanded. Auditing intensified. Procurement rules multiplied. Consultant dependence increased. legal compliance became central. Each reform aimed to prevent corruption, waste, discrimination, or environmental harm. But cumulatively, these layers shifted the internal culture of governance. The bias moved from execution toward avoidance of error. In such an environment, innovation becomes dangerous. Speed becomes suspicious. Initiative becomes risky. Institutional actors respond rationally. They minimize exposure. They document extensively. They defer decisions upward or outward. They hire consultants to distribute responsibility. They design processes that are defensible rather than efficient. The result is fragmentation. In earlier eras, large infrastructure projects were often managed within centralized public agencies, staffed with engineers and planners who built careers inside the state. Expertise accumulated internally. Institutional memory persisted. Over time, outsourcing expanded. Private contractors and consulting firms took on larger roles. Governments became coordinators rather than builders. While private expertise can be valuable, excessive reliance on external actors erodes internal capacity. Public agencies lose hands-on experience. Knowledge diffuses. When problems arise, responsibility blurs. Coordination becomes more difficult because authority is distributed across multiple agencies and contractors. Timelines stretch as approvals move sequentially rather than concurrently. Decision-making becomes iterative rather than decisive. Consider transit construction in major American cities. Projects often involve federal funding, state oversight, municipal planning, environmental review, and private contracting. Each layer introduces documentation requirements, reporting standards, and potential veto points. Delays compound. In contrast, countries with stronger centralized authority and more streamlined approval processes often complete comparable projects faster and at lower cost, not because they disregard safeguards entirely, but because institutional design prioritizes throughput. State capacity is therefore partly structural. It reflects how authority is allocated, how agencies coordinate, and how accountability mechanisms function. But it is also cultural. Modern governance in many advanced democracies is shaped by suspicion. Suspicion of concentrated power, suspicion of corruption, suspicion of unintended consequences. This suspicion is historically justified. Scandals, discrimination, and environmental disasters demanded correction. Yet a system organized primarily around distrust can struggle to act. When every decision anticipates litigation, media scrutiny, and political backlash, risk tolerance declines. Ambition narrows. The safest action becomes delay. This dynamic has consequences beyond infrastructure. Industrial policy, the effort to strategically support key industries, requires coordinated execution. Semiconductor manufacturing, for example, demands site preparation, energy provision, water access, workforce development, and regulatory approvals. Announcing funding is insufficient if ground cannot be broken efficiently. Similarly, housing reform may require state-level overrides of local zoning. Climate policy may require expedited permitting. These steps demand political courage and administrative coherence. Without state capacity, even well-funded initiatives stall. Another dimension of capacity is human capital. Public sector recruitment has struggled to compete with private sector compensation, particularly in technical fields. Engineers, data scientists, and project managers may find more lucrative opportunities elsewhere. Bureaucratic hiring processes can be slow and rigid. Retention becomes difficult. As expertise drains outward, reliance on consultants grows. Consultants provide analysis, but are not always accountable for long-term outcomes. Institutional knowledge fragments further. Technology adoption compounds the issue. While private firms rapidly integrate digital tools, some public agencies operate on legacy systems. Data interoperability is limited. Decision-making relies on outdated workflows. Modernization requires investment and cultural adaptation. Capacity is not restored through rhetoric. It requires organizational redesign. The authors of Abundance argue that the modern state must rediscover its builder function. This does not mean abandoning regulation. It means aligning oversight with execution. It means designing accountability systems that protect against abuse without suffocating action. This alignment demands several shifts. First, clarity of authority. When responsibility is diffuse, accountability evaporates. Clear lines of decision-making accelerate process. Second, parallelization of review. Sequential approvals lengthen timelines unnecessarily. Coordinated review frameworks reduce delay. Third, internal expertise. Building agencies must cultivate in-house technical competence rather than outsourcing core functions entirely. Fourth, outcome orientation. Metrics should emphasize delivery speed and cost control alongside compliance. These reforms are administrative, not ideological. They focus on competence. The crisis of state capacity is especially visible when comparing emergency response to long-term infrastructure. During acute crises, financial collapse, pandemics, governments can move rapidly. Stimulus packages are passed. Emergency powers are invoked. Vaccines are deployed at scale. The capacity for action exists. But in non-emergency contexts, procedural inertia dominates. Without the framing of crisis, urgency dissipates. Institutional rhythms slow. Climate change and housing scarcity, however, are chronic crises. Their urgency is persistent, but not always politically explosive. As a result, systems built for caution operate without acceleration. The economic implications are substantial. When the state cannot efficiently build public goods, private markets compensate imperfectly. Infrastructure bottlenecks constrain growth. Housing scarcity inflates asset prices. Energy grid limitations distort investment decisions. In effect, weak state capacity reduces national productivity. There is also a legitimacy dimension. Citizens evaluate governance not only by policy announcements, but by visible outcomes. When promised projects fail to materialize or costs escalate dramatically, trust declines. Cynicism grows. Political polarization intensifies. Abundance, as framed in the book, depends not merely on deregulation, but on competence. A high-capacity state can regulate effectively and build efficiently. It can protect environmental and social interests while delivering infrastructure at scale. It can experiment, learn, and iterate. The alternative is stagnation, a condition where goals multiply but outputs lag. State capacity is therefore foundational. Housing reform requires agencies that can rewrite zoning frameworks and enforce new standards. Energy transition requires permitting bodies that can process applications rapidly without sacrificing environmental integrity. Infrastructure modernization requires project managers capable of overseeing complex construction. Without capacity, funding becomes symbolic. The deeper challenge is psychological as much as structural. Modern democracies must regain confidence in their ability to act. The fear of error must be balanced by the fear of paralysis. Institutions must internalize that delay has costs: economic, environmental, social. Rebuilding capacity is not glamorous. It does not generate viral headlines. It involves procurement reform, civil service modernization, data integration, and cultural change. But without it, abundance remains rhetorical. The 20th century state proved it could mobilize resources at scale. The 21st century state must prove it can do so within democratic constraints and complex societies. The crisis is not that government exists. It is that government has drifted away from its builder identity. Restoring state capacity means restoring the ability to translate collective will into material reality, efficiently, responsibly, and at the speed the present demands. Part 5. The Politics of Veto Power. If state capacity explains why projects stall, veto politics explains how they stall. Modern democracies are built on participation, public hearings, comment periods, environmental review processes, neighborhood boards, judicial appeals. These mechanisms ensure that citizens can influence decisions affecting their lives. They are safeguards against authoritarian imposition. They embody respect for voice. But over time, voice can harden into veto. The distinction matters. Voice informs decisions. Veto stops them. In many advanced democracies, and especially in American local governance, the number of actors who can delay or block a project has expanded dramatically. A housing development may require approval from city councils, planning boards, environmental agencies, and sometimes state authorities. Community groups can mobilize opposition. Lawsuits can halt progress. Appeals can extend timelines indefinitely. Each actor may have legitimate concerns. The system is not irrational. It is cumulative. The more veto points exist, the greater the probability that any given project will encounter delay. When delay is easy and approval is complex, the rational expectation for builders shifts. Uncertainty rises, risk premiums increase, and fewer projects are initiated. This is not merely procedural friction, it is political structure. In political science, systems with multiple veto points are described as having high veto player density. The more actors whose consent is required, the harder it becomes to enact change. Stability increases, but so does inertia. In earlier eras, authority was often more centralized. Major infrastructure projects could proceed with fewer layers of approval. Public opposition existed, but institutional mechanisms to indefinitely delay were more limited. Over time, reforms designed to democratize planning added new layers of participation. Environmental review laws enabled lawsuits against projects deemed harmful. Local zoning boards gained authority over land use. Historic preservation statutes protected neighborhoods. These reforms expanded accountability, but they also multiplied veto opportunities. Consider a hypothetical urban housing project. The developer secures land and drafts plans. Zoning compliance must be verified. If variances are required, hearings are scheduled. Neighbors organize to oppose increased density, citing traffic, parking, or neighborhood character. Environmental review assesses impact. Appeals are filed. The project enters litigation. Financing becomes uncertain. Years pass. Even if the project ultimately proceeds, delay inflates costs. Some projects never survive the process. The asymmetry between concentrated opposition and diffuse beneficiaries intensifies the effect. Those who oppose development are often current residents with strong incentives to mobilize. They attend hearings, write letters, and hire attorneys. Those who would benefit from new housing, future residents, younger families, workers relocating from elsewhere, are not yet present to advocate. This dynamic skews outcomes toward preservation over expansion. The politics of veto power also intersects with property ownership. Homeowners often view property as their primary financial asset. Rising housing values benefit them. New supply may be perceived as threatening those gains, even if broader economic logic suggests otherwise. Protecting scarcity can align with personal financial interest. At the same time, renters and prospective residents bear the cost of limited supply. Yet their political power may be weaker or more fragmented. The result is a structural bias toward underbuilding. The same pattern appears in energy and infrastructure. A transmission line that would benefit millions may be opposed by a relatively small group of landowners whose property lies along its route. Legal frameworks allow those landowners to challenge approval. Courts weigh environmental and procedural claims. Timelines extend. Democratic systems are designed to prevent tyranny of the majority. Veto mechanisms protect minority rights. But when minority protections expand into routine obstruction, collective goals suffer. The politics of veto power therefore involve a trade-off between inclusion and execution. Participation is essential. But when participation mechanisms allow indefinite delay without clear thresholds for resolution, projects stagnate. One way to understand the issue is through incentives. Local decision-makers respond primarily to local constituents. They are evaluated by those who vote in municipal elections. If a project generates controversy among current residents, the political cost of approval may outweigh the diffuse benefits to future residents or the broader region. Thus, local governance structures may systematically underprovide housing and infrastructure relative to regional or national needs. In housing, this leads to exclusionary zoning. In energy, it slows grid expansion. In transit, it limits network growth. The politics of veto power are not accidental distortions. They are institutional outcomes of layered participation mechanisms combined with local accountability structures. Reform, therefore, requires recalibrating authority. Some jurisdictions have begun shifting zoning power from localities to state governments, particularly for housing near transit or job centers. This reduces the influence of hyperlocal opposition. It reframes housing supply as a statewide concern rather than a purely neighborhood matter. Similarly, proposals to streamline energy permitting often involve federal coordination to prevent projects from being stalled by fragmented local approvals. Such reforms are controversial because they appear to limit local autonomy. But the counter-argument is that local autonomy can impose costs on broader populations. When one neighborhood restricts housing, it raises regional prices. When one locality blocks transmission, it constrains national energy markets. The externalities extend beyond municipal borders. The politics of veto power thus reveal a deeper tension within federal systems. How to balance local voice with national interest. From a systems perspective, the optimal design allows meaningful input without infinite delay. Clear timelines, standardized review processes, and defined thresholds for approval can preserve participation while preventing paralysis. Another dimension is judicialization. Courts have become arenas for policy disputes. Litigation can pause projects for years. While legal recourse is vital for protecting rights, excessive reliance on courts to arbitrate planning decisions can slow progress significantly. Some reforms propose limiting the scope or duration of legal challenges for projects aligned with public interest goals, such as renewable energy or affordable housing. The central question is normative. At what point does protection become obstruction? Democratic societies must guard against abuse of power, but they must also guard against self-imposed stagnation. The politics of veto power are powerful because they align with deeply held values: fairness, voice, community control. Reforming veto structures can feel like eroding democracy itself. Yet when every actor holds de facto blocking authority, collective capacity diminishes. Abundance requires more than funding and ambition. It requires governance systems that can decide and then act. The challenge is not to silence opposition, but to structure it, to allow objections to be heard within defined windows and then resolved, to ensure that once standards are met, projects proceed. Otherwise, the default outcome becomes inertia. Inertia, in turn, reinforces scarcity. Scarcity fuels frustration. Frustration destabilizes politics. The politics of veto power are therefore not peripheral to abundance. They are central, because a society that cannot distinguish between voice and veto will struggle to build the future it desires. Part 6. Abundance as a moral vision. Up to this point, abundance may sound like an economic argument. Build more housing, deploy more energy, modernize infrastructure, restore state capacity, reform veto politics. But abundance is not merely about logistics. It is about morality, because scarcity shapes ethics. When resources feel limited, when housing is scarce, energy is constrained, opportunity is restricted, politics becomes distributive. Who gets what? Who is prioritized? Who is excluded? Scarcity intensifies zero-sum thinking. Gains for one group feel like losses for another. Abundance reframes the moral terrain. It asks a different question. What if the goal is not to fight over slices of the pie, but to expand the pie itself? This is not naive optimism. It is a recognition that many of today's fiercest conflicts are downstream of artificial constraint. When housing supply is limited, inclusion becomes politically volatile. When energy capacity is tight, climate policy becomes contentious. When infrastructure is strained, growth feels threatening. Scarcity turns trade-offs into identity battles. Abundance, by contrast, reduces friction. If housing is plentiful in high-opportunity cities, access expands. If clean energy is abundant and cheap, decarbonization becomes less politically painful. If transit is efficient and widespread, urban density becomes less disruptive. Production diffuses tension. The moral argument of abundance is therefore rooted in dignity. A society that fails to build enough homes effectively decides who belongs and who does not through explicit exclusion, but through price. A society that cannot expand energy capacity restricts economic mobility. A society that delays infrastructure limits opportunity for future generations. Abundance is not consumption excess. It is access expansion. It affirms that growth and equity are not inherently opposed. In fact, growth in supply is often a prerequisite for equity in distribution. Consider housing again. In a scarcity framework, housing policy debates focus on rent control, subsidies, or allocation mechanisms. These tools may mitigate harm, but do not eliminate scarcity itself. The moral tension persists because demand exceeds supply. In an abundance framework, the priority shifts toward enabling construction at scale. Inclusionary policies still matter, but they operate within a context of expanding supply. The moral burden shifts from managing shortage to facilitating opportunity. The same applies to climate. A scarcity mindset frames climate policy as sacrifice, fewer emissions, reduced consumption, constrained growth. An abundance mindset frames climate policy as innovation, more clean energy, more electrification, more efficiency. The moral tone shifts from restriction to construction. This shift is not cosmetic. It affects political coalitions. Historically, progressive movements often combined redistribution with production. The New Deal was not only about social protection, it was about building dams, electrifying rural regions, and expanding infrastructure. Material expansion underwrote social reform. Over time, progressivism in many contexts became more associated with regulation than construction. Protection replaced production as the dominant instinct. While protection is necessary, production is equally moral. If a government cannot build enough housing, it indirectly reinforces inequality. If it cannot deliver transit, it restricts mobility. If it cannot modernize energy systems, it perpetuates environmental harm. Abundance reframes state competence as ethical responsibility. It argues that delivering public goods efficiently is not technocratic minutia, it is justice. There is also a generational dimension. Younger generations inherit infrastructure they did not design and debt they did not incur. They face climate risks intensified by delay. They confront housing markets shaped by decades of restrictive zoning. Scarcity constrains their mobility, family formation, and wealth accumulation. Abundance is forward-looking. It recognizes that institutional design today shapes the opportunity landscape tomorrow. If governance systems are too paralyzed to build, future citizens bear the cost. Thus, abundance is intergenerational fairness. It rejects the idea that preservation of current arrangements should override expansion of opportunity. It challenges the notion that protecting neighborhood character is morally superior to enabling housing access. It questions whether procedural purity should outweigh environmental urgency. Importantly, abundance does not dismiss protection. Environmental safeguards, community voice, and legal accountability remain essential, but they must be balanced against the moral imperative to build. Protection without production becomes stagnation. Production without protection becomes exploitation. The moral vision of abundance lies in integration. It envisions institutions capable of safeguarding rights while delivering outcomes. It assumes that democratic societies can act decisively without abandoning inclusion. It refuses to accept paralysis as prudence. At its core, abundance is optimistic about human coordination. It assumes that complex societies can solve coordination failures, that permitting systems can be redesigned, that state capacity can be rebuilt, that zoning can be reformed, that energy grids can be expanded, This optimism is not utopian. It is pragmatic. The alternative, embracing scarcity as inevitable, carries its own moral consequences. Persistent scarcity entrenches inequality. It amplifies resentment. It fosters exclusionary politics. It rewards incumbency over aspiration. Abundance disrupts this pattern. When supply expands, tension eases. When infrastructure improves, productivity rises. When energy becomes cheaper and cleaner, environmental and economic goals align. The moral appeal of abundance is therefore grounded in material outcomes. It seeks to make generosity easier by making production robust. It reduces the need for zero-sum redistribution by increasing total provision. It supports equity not only through transfer, but through expansion. In a wealthy society, chronic scarcity is often self-imposed. Institutional design, not physical limitation, constrains output. Reimagining abundance means reimagining governance. It asks whether the moral project of democracy includes building enough for all who seek opportunity, whether justice includes competence, whether fairness includes speed. Abundance is not excess. It is the restoration of confidence that collective action can improve material conditions. It is the belief that progress should be visible. In homes built, energy generated, infrastructure completed. And it is the conviction that enabling such progress is not merely efficient policy. It is moral responsibility. Part 7. What this means for investors and builders. Up to now, abundance has been framed as a governance and moral issue, but it is also an investment thesis. When a society enters structural scarcity, not because resources are absent, but because systems restrict supply, markets distort. Prices no longer reflect pure fundamentals. They reflect bottlenecks. For investors and builders, bottlenecks are signals. They reveal where demand persistently exceeds supply. They expose friction points in the system. They indicate sectors where reform, innovation, or redesign could unlock disproportionate value. The housing crisis, for example, is not merely a social issue. It is a supply constraint embedded in regulation. That constraint drives rising rents, elevated property valuations in restricted zones, and growing political pressure for reform. An investor reading this landscape sees several layers. First, incumbents in constrained markets benefit. Owners of scarce assets, land in highly regulated cities, permitted projects, entitled properties, hold scarcity premiums. Their valuations reflect limited competition. Second, innovators who reduce friction gain leverage. Modular construction, prefabrication systems, software platforms that streamline permitting, zoning analytics tools. These technologies do not eliminate regulation, but they reduce cost and uncertainty within it. Third, reform creates repricing moments. When jurisdictions upzone transit corridors or streamline approval processes, land values can shift rapidly. The supply curve moves. Early positioning matters. The same logic applies to energy. The energy transition is capital-intensive. Renewable generation, grid modernization, battery storage, hydrogen infrastructure, advanced nuclear. These sectors require massive build-out, yet permitting delays, transmission bottlenecks, and regulatory fragmentation slow deployment. This creates structural opportunity. Investors who identify choke points, grid capacity limits, storage gaps, interconnection queues, can anticipate where capital will flow once reform accelerates. Companies positioned to operate within or around permitting constraints may gain durable advantage. For example, distributed energy solutions, rooftop solar, microgrids, localized storage partially bypass large-scale transmission bottlenecks. Software firms that optimize grid efficiency increase effective capacity without waiting for new infrastructure. Advanced materials, companies that reduce construction time compress timelines. Scarcity creates incentives for workaround innovation. But there is also risk. Political backlash against scarcity can be abrupt. Rent control measures, windfall taxes, aggressive regulation, or sudden zoning changes can alter economics quickly. Investors must distinguish between structural scarcity that will persist and political scarcity that is likely to be corrected. The broader insight is this: when systems suppress supply, capital allocates differently. In abundant systems, competition compresses margins. In constrained systems, incumbency advantages grow. The key question becomes whether constraint is durable or temporary. Builders face a related but distinct calculation. Entrepreneurs operating in regulated environments must master not only product market fit, but regulatory market fit. Understanding permitting pathways, stakeholder incentives, and local governance structures becomes as important as engineering design. The builder of housing in a high-demand city is not simply a developer. They are a negotiator within a complex approval ecosystem. The energy entrepreneur is not merely deploying turbines. They are navigating multi-level regulatory frameworks. This reality rewards strategic patience and institutional literacy. It also suggests that builders who can partner with public institutions rather than work around them may scale more effectively. Public-private coordination, when functional, can accelerate delivery. At a macro level, abundance implies a long-term shift. Political pressure for supply expansion tends to build gradually, then crystallize. Housing affordability crises generate reform movements. Energy reliability concerns prompt permitting overhaul. Infrastructure decay sparks modernization campaigns. When reform momentum accelerates, capital deployment surges. Investors who anticipate these inflection points, who recognize that scarcity cannot persist indefinitely without political correction, can position ahead of structural repricing. However, abundance is not solely about extracting opportunity from bottlenecks. It is also about creating value through capacity expansion. A society that restores building competence expands its growth frontier. Productivity rises, labor mobility improves, energy costs stabilize, infrastructure efficiency enhances private sector performance. In such an environment, returns compound not from artificial scarcity, but from genuine expansion. This distinction matters philosophically and financially. Scarcity-driven gains often rely on restricted access and constrained competition. Abundance-driven gains arise from scaling systems and broadening participation. For long-term builders, especially those thinking in decades rather than quarters, abundance is the more durable strategy. It aligns capital with production rather than obstruction. It bets on institutional improvement rather than persistent paralysis. There is also a geopolitical layer. Countries that can deploy infrastructure rapidly will attract capital. Talent migrates toward regions with affordable housing and reliable energy. Industrial policy succeeds where state capacity supports execution. Investors evaluating national competitiveness must therefore assess not only fiscal strength or market size, but administrative competence. Can the state approve and build efficiently? Can infrastructure scale with demand? Can reform overcome veto politics? These are not abstract political questions. They shape return profiles. For builders within the private sector, abundance thinking shifts mindset. Instead of assuming fixed constraints, it asks, where can friction be reduced? Where can throughput increase? Where can processes be redesigned? Innovation in the 21st century increasingly targets coordination failures. Software reduces paperwork. Automation shortens construction timelines. Data analytics improves planning accuracy. These tools enhance institutional capacity indirectly. Builders who understand the architecture of constraint, zoning rules, permitting pathways, grid interconnections, can design solutions that fit reality rather than idealized markets. Ultimately, abundance reframes the investor-builder role. It suggests that capital allocation should not merely chase scarcity premiums, but anticipate system redesign. That value creation lies not only in owning constrained assets, but in enabling supply expansion. In a world where permission has become the scarcest resource, those who understand how permission is granted and how it might be restructured operate with asymmetric insight. Because when systems shift from stagnation toward construction, the repricing is not marginal. It is structural. Conclusion: build more than you block. Every era is defined by its dominant constraint. For the early industrial age, it was capital. For the post-war period, it was scale. For much of the 20th century, it was material scarcity. For our era, the defining constraint is permission. We do not lack land. We do not lack capital. We do not lack engineering talent. We do not lack technological capacity. What we lack, increasingly, is the ability to translate ambition into execution. Housing crises persist not because wood and steel are unavailable, but because systems make it difficult to build at density. Clean energy lags not because sunlight is scarce, but because transmission lines face procedural delay. Infrastructure costs soar not because concrete is rare, but because governance is fragmented. The pattern repeats. The 20th century state proved that democratic societies could build at scale. Highways were laid. Dams rose. Universities expanded. Entire suburbs materialized within a generation. That era was imperfect. It imposed costs and excluded voices. Corrective reforms were necessary. But correction became accumulation. Layer upon layer of review, consultation, litigation, and veto transformed governance culture. Caution replaced confidence. Process overshadowed outcome. Delivery slowed. We moved from a politics of building to a politics of blocking. Blocking is not inherently wrong. Blocking protects communities. Blocking prevents harm. Blocking enforces accountability. A society without constraint is reckless. But a society defined primarily by constraint becomes stagnant. The deeper message of abundance is not that regulation is bad. It is that imbalance is dangerous. Protection without production produces scarcity. Voice without resolution produces paralysis. Oversight without throughput produces frustration. Abundance is therefore not excess. It is restoration. It is the restoration of state competence, the restoration of institutional confidence, the restoration of belief that democratic systems can deliver material progress. When societies build effectively, politics calms. Housing abundance reduces exclusionary pressure. Energy abundance lowers geopolitical anxiety. Infrastructure abundance enhances productivity and mobility. Scarcity sharpens conflict. Abundance diffuses it. This is not theoretical. It is visible across regions. Cities that allow housing expansion maintain more moderate price growth. Countries that streamline infrastructure approvals build faster and cheaper. Energy systems that expand transmission stabilize supply. Building changes psychology. When citizens see tangible improvements, new housing, modern transit, reliable grids, they perceive governance as functional. Trust strengthens, cynicism weakens. Conversely, when projects stall for years, when costs multiply, when promises remain rhetorical, distrust spreads. Politics shifts toward grievance. Thus, build more than you block is not a slogan. It is a governing principle. It means rebalancing institutions so that participation informs but does not indefinitely delay. It means designing regulatory systems with clear timelines and defined endpoints. It means investing in public sector expertise rather than hollowing it out. It means aligning incentives around delivery, not just compliance. It also requires courage. Reforming zoning invites opposition. Streamlining permitting triggers resistance from stakeholders accustomed to leverage. Centralizing authority challenges local autonomy. Yet without reform, stagnation deepens. The choice is not between democracy and efficiency. It is between paralysis and competence within democracy. Abundance demands institutional maturity, the confidence to say yes when standards are met, the discipline to limit endless appeals, the clarity to distinguish between legitimate protection and strategic obstruction. For investors and builders, this conclusion carries practical weight. Scarcity can be profitable in the short term. Constrained supply inflates asset values. Bottlenecks create premiums. But over time, structural scarcity invites political correction. Reform cycles reshape markets. The durable strategy aligns with expansion, with systems that increase throughput and reduce friction. For policymakers, the conclusion is moral. In wealthy societies, chronic scarcity of essential goods is often self-imposed. If families cannot afford housing in productive regions, if clean energy deployment lags despite capital availability, if infrastructure decays while funds sit allocated, governance has failed its ethical mandate. Competence is justice. The 21st century presents challenges that require scale. Climate mitigation, urbanization, technological transformation, demographic shifts. These cannot be solved through distribution alone. They require construction. Building is not glamorous. It is administrative. It involves procurement reform, civil service modernization, digital integration, and regulatory recalibration. It demands patience and persistence. But without building, ambition collapses. The final insight is simple. A society that builds shapes its future. A society that blocks preserves its present. Preservation has value, but preservation without expansion becomes exclusion. It locks opportunity behind rising costs. It privileges incumbents over entrants. It protects current arrangements at the expense of future possibility. Abundance reopens possibility. It does not promise perfection. It promises momentum, momentum in housing supply, momentum in energy transition, momentum in infrastructure delivery, momentum in institutional competence. The defining political question of our time is not whether we can imagine better systems, it is whether we can construct them. Build more than you block, because the future will not be limited by what we lack in resources, but by what we refuse to permit ourselves to create.